So it's probably, again, restricted to people who have actual personal knowledge. RIN's available for those situations where the notary knows the signer or represents the signer, and they can sign these documents remotely. Again, real estate agents, auctioneers, attorneys, those type of things, they're going to have personal knowledge, so that's why they were granted that status from the beginning. For everybody else, you have to have some serious dealings that you can prove that you have a relationship with that person that would give you knowledge of who that is. This here on the screen is what the in 2021, this is what they added for the acknowledgement form. Again, it's very similar to what it looks like typically, but they did add in that section there where the undersigned officer appeared, the signer's name with a remote location of. That's where you would fill in the notary will fill in the city and state that the signer was in at the time. Obviously, the notary still has to be in South Dakota. They can't remotely be anywhere else but the state. So there's an example there. If I was signing in front of Eric, and that's what that would look like. Again, it just shows where I was located at the time of my signature, and that's how it would get recorded at the courthouse with that on there. So everybody knows I'm dealing with a document that wasn't signed in my immediate presence, but remotely. So yeah, identity of the parties established by personal knowledge between the notary public and the signer. Again, unless you're going to use that two different methods of identity proofing, which, like we just discussed, is more of a RON issue than a RIN issue. The confirmation that the signer signed the actual instrument happens when the notary signs and affixes that seal to their document. Again, when you get those documents back, you're going to be, without the acknowledgement stating that it was in a different location on a different date, it's going to look very similar to any original document you would receive to record. And that does put the burden of the notary to actually know the signer and to confirm that the document from them is an unaltered original. Who can use RIN? Well, anybody. That's a notary. That's already a notary in the state of South Dakota. You've gone through the Secretary of State. You're registered. You have your notary's stamp on file with the state. The only difference, again, being that you have to have a personal knowledge. You can't just take a copy of see a copy of a driver's license and call it good. There's a little bit more of a higher standard when it comes to remote ink notary. So what do you need to do this? You have to have some kind of video communication technology to still visually observe a signer signing a document. We don't have to maintain the video of the execution of the document for RIN. That's a RON requirement. And signed original instrument is sent to the notary, and then they affix their seal. There's not really a standard or requirement for what kind of video communication you use at this point. When it comes to RIN, it could be just about anything. FaceTime, Zoom, Teams meeting, whatever that may look like for you and yours, or maybe you're retro and you're using Skype still, I don't know. But those all work and are all acceptable when it comes to remote ink. Again, the location of the notary, you need to be physically located in the state still as the notary. You can't be remote notarizing something while you're in Wyoming. If you are a South Dakota notary, that applies. Where can the signer be? Literally just about anywhere. This was, again, put in place so people in overseas could still sign documents and get those back. I don't know if you've dealt much with having people sign overseas, but sometimes it can be quite a hassle to get them into the State Department or wherever they're at over there to get something signed and then back to you. It's a lot of times it's a 30-day window that they have to set a date to go in and meet to get a notary to sign something at an embassy. Some of the issues that have been seen with RIN, a notary not using the video communication technology to observe Obviously, you still have to witness the signature. A landline phone call doesn't work. Can't just say, that sounds like that was Eric and call it good. Notary not being located physically in the state of South Dakota when the signer executes the document. Again, obviously you are only a notary in the state when you're in the state. Incorrect acknowledgments, we did have issue with that at the beginning because we didn't really have a set standard, but that 2021 update amendment created that form that's been used pretty standard now, and that's kind of cleared up a lot of that issue. And the other one that kind of comes into play, we got signers and notaries trying to use electronic signatures. That doesn't fly with RIN because that's the point, remote ink notarization. Again, you're going to be looking at, for all intents and purposes, original actual signatures when you get those documents and they get recorded. That was something to appease at the time the Register of Deeds. In a lot of ways, they wanted to see wet signatures. They weren't taking electronic signatures at that point, and that's where we're moving into Ron, and that's where Shane will take over.
Hi, for those who don't know me, my name is Shane Pullman. I'm an attorney with the South Dakota Department of Transportation, and I do have some fair involvement with remote online notarization. I drafted the original bill, which became Senate Bill 211, and then worked with governmental and private stakeholders to make sure it was a bill everybody could enjoy and had all the protections that everybody needed. And then I lobbied for it on behalf of the department during legislative session. So remote online notarization is the newest way that South Dakota has allowed folks to notarize. The Mortgage Bankers Association and the American Land Title Association define it as the use of audiovisual technology to complete a notarial act when the principal is not in the same physical location as the notary public. And it deviates from remote ink notarization in that it moves the process one step further on the spectrum of remoteness. And it also will never generate a document with an original wet signature. Rather, it focuses on electronic documents, where electronic signatures of both the notary officer and the signer of the document are electronically placed on the document. Our statute this says remote ink notarization. I believe that should be remote online. I apologize for that. But it's found at SDCL 18.1, 11.2 to 11.8. And then you also need the definitions in 18-1-1.1 to fully understand what's required. This was just passed in the 2024's legislative session, so it's still very new. And a lot of folks are still trying to figure out how to implement this in doing their notary business. The law did allow for the Secretary of State to expand upon the requirements of these new statutes to promulgate rules that would ensure integrity, security, authenticity of online notarial acts. Again, a lot like with remote ink, when we were talking about remote online notarization, there was a big concern about fraud and ensuring that everything was true and correct, especially for documents that might be recorded at the Register of Deeds. So the bill allowed for the Secretary of State to promulgate rules ensuring the integrity, but the grant of rulemaking authority was permissive. It wasn't mandatory. So I believe the only rules that have been successfully passed by the Secretary of State so far are updating their forms to allow for somebody to acknowledge or be approved to do remote online notarization. I haven't really seen anything beyond that towards the integrity, security, or authenticity. Those may be forthcoming. So then we want to talk about some of the requirements of offering remote online notarization. Those are primarily found in SDCL 18.1, 11.2. They're a little bit different than the remote ink requirements. They're a little bit harsher or more strict in terms of what's required, because as you move on this spectrum to more remoteness, the concern of fraud gets greater. So again, just like with wet ink or remote ink, you have to be, as a notary, physically present in the state of South Dakota. That hasn't changed. You have to make use of video communication technology, a lot like with remote ink. But now, the personal knowledge aspect of it is different. With the other forms of notary, you could rely on your personal knowledge or a professional relationship to satisfy that requirement of, I know who this person is. Remote online notarization takes that step further, where you have to use a third-party process or software to actually identify that person on your behalf, and then you're allowed to rely on that verification of that person. So generally, notary public has to have personal knowledge using two different methods of identity proofing. You have to affix your signature to the electronic record. You have to indicate the remote location of the person who's signing the document. And you have to have a statement that the person was not in your physical presence. There's an updated notarial certificate that will reflect this. And then, most notably, unlike Remote Ink, there's this extra safeguard that you have to create and store an audio-visual copy of the video telecommunication call and the signing of the document for a period of 10 years. And that's not required with Remote Ink, but it will be for when you do remote online notarization. There's a couple key concepts. Identity proofing. So I talked a little bit about this before, but it's defined in the definition section of Chapter 18.1 as a process or service by which a third party provides a notarial officer with a reasonable means to verify the identity of an individual by review of personal information from public or proprietary data sources. And this specifically under statute has to be done by a third party. It's not something that you as a notary can do. So what this typically looks like in a remote online notarization setting is that there are these third-party software vendors who provide the audio-visual communication, the document signing capabilities all in one package is typically what I envision. And when the signer of the document logs in, they're going to be required to typically upload a copy of their government ID, as well as answer some questions that were generated through looking at maybe their credit report or some public information. What zip code did you used to live on? What street did you used to live on? Did you used to own this type of vehicle? That sort of thing. Something that only the signer of the document, if they're who they say they are, would likely know. And then you as a notary are allowed to rely that, if this software said this person's authenticated, that they are. Next, with respect to keeping an audio-visual copy, the law requires that you must retain a copy of the audio-visual copy, and it has to be using a tamper-evident notarization system. So I want to talk about the tamper-evident just briefly. We were just talking about this software that does the authentication of the individual for you. Those systems will also allow for the document to be signed. And then once both the signer has put their signature on it and the notary has put their signature and seal on it, it will create a hash code or some metadata on the document that if that document is ever altered after it's been fully signed, that will be able to be detected through the metadata in the document. So it would be evident that if somebody tampered with it. So if you're picking a software to use, you have to make sure that they offer that protection. But in terms of keeping the audiovisual copy, you're required to keep that for 10 years. And that is even in the case if you are suspended, you're suspended or revoked from your notary commission, or upon death or incapacity. So if you're a notary doing remote online notarization, you need to make sure that you have a system in place or something to store these audiovisual copies for a period of 10 years. We did add in the bill that in lieu of retaining copies yourself, they could be held by a repository designated by you or as a notary. And we added this because a lot of the systems that offer these services for you to do will store those for you. Or if you were to hire a cloud storage system or somewhere that would not be in your physical presence, but be yours elsewhere, that would be fine. So just make sure you have a plan, even in the event of death, that these are held somewhere and could be retrieved in the event that somebody needed to review those for authenticity. Let's see. I talked a little bit about tamper evidence system already. So one thing that's interesting is when you're choosing these systems to do a remote online notarization, there are all these requirements, but it has to be tamper evident. It has to provide storage, or you have to be able to store it, maintain a copy. But there are these requirements in law, and you have to, when you register to be a notary, with the Secretary of State, you have to acknowledge that you're going to be doing electronic notarization. And you have to tell the Secretary of State, here is the software, here's the system that I am using. And that gets recorded with the Secretary of State. And you're not allowed to deviate to a different system unless you get that cleared with the Secretary of State first. And one of the requirements is it has to have this tamper evidence system. And that was a result of some of the concerns of fraud. So when we were working on the bill, we had involved a lot of the folks from the different registers of deeds office. And because remote online notarization doesn't generate a document with a wet signature, there was some concern about, are these recordable? Could I record a deed or an affidavit with the Register of Deeds? And there's a requirement that only original documents in terms of recordable instruments can be recorded. So we added into the bill, and it got passed, that even though you get electronic documents out of this, they are legally notarized under South Dakota. So we added in what became SDCL 18.1.11.5 that requires registers of deeds to accept a copy of an electronic document if there's this separate certificate from the notary in wet ink that accompanies it to the Register of Deeds office. And this was done there are several counties that don't do electronic recording. So this would be how you would record a remote online notarized document with one of those counties. But for counties that do electronic recording, you should just be able to submit the electronic document you get right from the notarization. And I believe we have a copy of that certificate. So we added this form that got added in. And if a notary who did a remote online notarization is going to submit a document for recording, this is what would be filled out and submitted with a wet signature of the notary and a true and correct copy of the online electronic document to the Register of Deeds, and that will be recorded. It's basically an affidavit, essentially. We've also got the acknowledgement form. This is also reproduced in statute. So there were a lot of requirements for when you're doing remote online notarization about acknowledging, where the person was, stating that this notarization was done through audiovisual communication, not in your presence. This form, straight from statute, is what you should use if you're doing remote online notarization. It's just presented here for your review. And then this is another, this is for remote ink. Or is that just a, oh, no, sorry, I just have remote ink, I apologize. It should be remote online. But this is an example of what that acknowledgement would look like when it's filled out. You can see that it's acknowledgement that you did personal knowledge by identity proofing, positive identification, same person within the instrument. They appeared before you, not in your physical presence, but through means of tamper-evident electronic notarization system, you observed them execute the electronic document, and then you state their position, and then you confirm and affix your seal. So it contains everything that the statutes require. So if you just use the form acknowledgement, you'll be fine. So identity proofing, we added that in as a stricter method of identifying the person because you have this further disconnect between the notary and the person signing the document. So there has to be two methods of identity proofing, but identity proofing will be handled mostly through the software is what I would expect, or some other third party who might provide those services. So the fact that it says two different methods, that's typically, in the way I've seen it, the uploading of the government ID and the being able to answer questions about their history or their public records or credit report, what have you. And then you'll fix your tamper-evident seal after you've brought up the document, confirmed who they are, and then you will see them place their electronic signature on the document. And then as the notary, you will place your electronic signature and seal on the document. And when you do, that becomes, it's considered a tamper-evident seal. So it'll create that metadata acknowledge or thumbprint that if it's changed, it'll be noticeable. And then that tamper evidence seal will basically be an acknowledgement that you've done identity proofing and this person is who they say they are. So going back to generally, who can use remote online notarization? Well, any South Dakota notary can, but you do need to do an update or a new application with the Secretary of State because they've updated their forms. And they have a special section for if you want to do remote online notarization, you need to acknowledge that you will do so and tell them what software, what tamper evident software you're going to be using. And then that gets sent to the Secretary of State and they'll approve it. I had assumed when I was drafting the original bill, at least that the Secretary of State would approve and at least make sure that the software you're using is compliant with statute. I don't believe they're currently doing that. I think they'll just note what you're using and then it's up to you as a notary to make sure that what you're using is compliant with the statute. And that can be a little problematic because there's a lot of different softwares out there and it's not always transparent what they can do and what they can't and whether it complies with state law. So if you're considering doing remote online notarization, I would encourage you to ensure you do your due diligence. So essentially what's needed other than the approval by the Secretary of State, you'll need the third-party identity proofing system, tamper evident electronic notarization system, and then a way to retain the audiovisual copy for 10 years. There are a few softwares out there that can do all of this, where it's just a suite and you just get a subscription or a license or whatever their model is, and then they'll be able to handle it all for you. And then just like with Remote Inc., then you do need to be physically present in South Dakota when you do a remote online notarization. But the person who's signing the document could be anywhere. And a lot of this was done because we've got people overseas doing military service. We've got people who are vacationing, wintering in different parts of the country, or people just who have business interests here that are elsewhere. So this should be convenient. And one of the benefits of remote online notarization is that even with Remote Inc., you have to wait for that physical document to be mailed to you to sign and put a wet signature on it. But with remote online notarization, you could have a fully notarized legal document in minutes. There have been a few issues with remote online notarization, especially considering it's so new. There's been difficulty getting remote notarization companies needed information. Again, it's hard to tell sometimes whether the platform or the software you're getting is compliant with the law. And I know for me, I'm not all that technologically savvy. So just make sure you do your due diligence. And I don't know that I would rely on the Secretary of State to tell you whether it's a good product or not. So far, there's a lack of published administrative rules to satisfy requirements on authenticity and security. Those may be forthcoming, but it's also hard for remote online notarization vendors to know whether they comply or whether that might be changing in the near future. But I do know that there are several vendors that you can use for remote online notarization successfully today. And then the last issue we've seen is just a bit of lack of understanding from some notaries, believing that they can perform remote online notarization on their own without third-party companies, especially without the identity proofing, which is by statute is required to be done by a third party. I may have been a little long-winded, but thank you. If you have any questions.
Just to kind of add as we, kind of wrap up for what goes with it. One of the biggest things just to be aware of is that remote ink notarization, remote online notarization are really two completely separate different things for what goes with it. One is designed to easily supplement what you already do for in-person notarization for what goes on. The other is designed to use a completely different platform and system and everything that goes with it. You can't just decide today to do remote online notarization as a notary. There's some planning and forethought that goes into it to make sure you have those items that comply with the statutory requirements and everything else that goes in. I know from experience for myself, from others in the industry that goes with it, it's very much a case where figuring out who your vendor is going to be is a big part of that process in terms of making sure what they offer for those solutions and also figuring out how to deploy the product to some extent to make sure you're doing so correctly. Are you making sure that your records are being kept for what goes along with it? How do you have that accessible if someone had a request for those, copies of the audio visual communication at some point in the future? What does your tamper evidence seal look like? Just putting down when you reapply or apply for the first time for your notarization permit, that you want to do remote notarization isn't enough. You need to put that additional information. And that's somewhat what some of the companies that do provide services, it's a chicken and egg type situation where they want to see you approved first before they let you create that tamper evidence seal for what goes with it, which needs to go on to the application with the Secretary of State's office for what gets submitted. But that's something that can be, worked out as you kind of work through that process. A big thing for whatever type of notarization you're using is just understanding that what is required to execute the document and notarize it doesn't always mean that it matches what's needed to either record an instrument or to ensure a real estate transaction or to meet a requirement that someone else has. The general practice in South Dakota is that if someone is not physically signing in front of a notary that goes with it, it usually is still subject to some sort of approval by the insuring underwriter for a real estate transaction. And we've also seen that in some cases for businesses too, where there might be some amount of like skepticism of what goes in for the remote ink, remote online notarization with it. I think a big part that we also see is the papering out process that's there in 1811 5.5 for that certificate that allows it to be recorded does help a lot with register of deeds. I know we've run into that issue where even in states before South Dakota that had remote online notarization, trying to get a document recorded in state after the fact was a challenge, because if your register of deeds office doesn't accept electronically recorded instruments, they may raise objection to receiving something that doesn't have a signature that's in ink anywhere on it. I don't know. I think that's gotten a little bit better, but we still don't have every county in the state that accepts electronic recording, which is usually what goes with remote notarization. So that lack of electronic recording or the lack of use of electronic recording in some places where it is used is kind of the reason why you may need to use that certificate that goes in. Before I say anything else, does anybody have any questions? I wasn't seeing any in the chat with it. Doesn't look like we've got anything there. Shane, Travis, anything else that you guys have for it?
No, not really. Just that there's definitely an education process that goes with this. I know once remote online notarization was passed, there's been a group of people, let's call them realtors, that assume that remote online notarization, once it got passed, meant remote signatures. Things like DocuSign that would be acceptable, and then they want to have things DocuSigned and then notarized by you later. And obviously that doesn't fall anywhere in the parameters of either remote ink or remote online. So it's just an education process that goes along with this to make sure that we're following these standards that are set forth so that we can actually record these documents.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I can't think of anything else, but if anyone has any questions later, feel free to reach out and we'll do our best to help.
I think the biggest thing to just stress is this is, a new area that's really developing. We're 6 years in from the first time that we had remote notarization of any type in South Dakota with remote ink notarization. We didn't anticipate when that was going on that it was going to, lead to, a situation for a pandemic where people needed to sign documents remotely, which caused the first set of revisions. And then that led to the work, that Shane, Travis, and others put together on the new version remote online notarization that better matches it. Just something to be very aware of with remote online notarization. Well, we have remote ink in South Dakota and some other states have remote ink. The primary form nationally is remote online notarization, and there's very strict standards which our statutes match. That's the reason why it requires these extra things that go with it. There is not an easy form, as I would like to say, of remote online notarization. It all involves this extra work about identity verification, metadata that goes in with it, recording and receiving information, because that's what's been agreed to by not just the Mortgage Bankers Association, the American Land Title Association, but other real estate business and other professional groups have determined that's an acceptable standard for what the risk piece is that goes in to remote online notarization. So it really does kind of limit us when it comes to, in South Dakota, what our statutes are done in a way to match what's done nationally, so it's accepted by those industries and by others out of state that goes with it. So it does make it so that there's not really an option to kind of tweak our statutes to make it more local friendly for what goes on. That standard is going to be the same, and it also helps us. Eventually, there may be a federal standard that's established through the Secure Notarization Act and others that are proposed each legislative session in Congress. They don't want to pass anything, so why would they pass this one as well that has no opposition to it? But it's important just to know that if a national standard was established, it does create carve-outs to match what's done, on a state level, as long as that meets some basic guidelines. And that's why the South Dakota statute is written the way that it is. Otherwise, with that, I see we're just at about 50 minutes for it. Please feel free as you continue on your journey down into remote notarization. If you have questions about how to comply with Remote Inc., Remote Online, you can reach out to Travis, Shane, or myself along with it. And we look forward to helping answer any questions along the way and appreciate your guys' time today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Melissa, I think you are still muted on your side. Nope. Nothing coming through.
I'm not sure why that's not working.
Might need to change the source for where under the settings for where the microphone spot is.